In the world of high-end gastronomy, tradition is not just a guideline. It is a fortress. For some, the rules of cooking are sacred scriptures, written in centuries of history, and defended with religious fervor. But what happens when an immovable object meets an unstoppable force of cultural adaptation? What happens when the strict, disciplined heritage of Naples collides head-on with the sweet, chaotic, and joyful soul of Manila? This is the story of Chef Marco Moretti, a man who believed that pasta was a serious business, and how a plate of neon red spaghetti, studded with hot dogs and sweetened with banana ketchup, shattered his ego and rebuilt his heart. This is the story of the day Italy mocked the Philippines, only to ask for seconds. Marco Moretti was not merely a chef. He was a custodian of Neapolitan history, a man whose culinary lineage could be traced back to the dusty streets of 19th century Naples. In his world, there were only 3 ingredients that belonged in a tomato sauce: San Marzano tomatoes, extra virgin olive oil, and fresh basil, perhaps with a whisper of garlic if one was feeling adventurous. Anything else was considered an act of war against the motherland. He ran La Purezza, a Michelin-starred establishment in Rome that was famous not for what it added to food, but for what it strictly left out. To Marco, fusion cuisine was confusion cuisine, a dilution of identity that he frequently criticized in food magazines. He was a purist, a man who believed that perfection had already been achieved 100 years ago and that innovation was simply the desperate attempt of the untalented to be noticed. His reputation as a hardliner was exactly why the producers of Global Palate, a hit streaming culinary documentary series, invited him to be the head judge for their Southeast Asian tour. They knew his disdain for non-traditional pasta dishes would make for explosive television. Marco accepted the invitation with a sense of missionary duty, viewing the trip not as a cultural exchange, but as an opportunity to educate the misguided corners of the culinary world on the proper way to treat Italian ingredients. As his plane touched down in the humid heat of Manila, Marco adjusted his sunglasses, prepared to be unimpressed. He had read about the local variations of Western dishes, dismissing them as fast food abominations. He was mentally rehearsing his critiques, ready to dismantle any chef who dared to serve him overcooked noodles, unaware that the Philippines had a way of disarming cynicism with a weapon he didn't understand: radical hospitality. The venue for the main event was a sprawling, open-air night market in the district of Quiapo, transformed into a high-end kitchen stadium for the show. The air was thick with the scent of charcoal, roasting pork, and the exhausted jeepneys, a sensory overload that Marco found immediately overwhelming. Unlike the sterile, stainless steel silence of his kitchen in Rome, this place was alive, chaotic, and screaming with color. He watched as local cooks prepped ingredients he couldn't name, his nose wrinkling at the pungent smell of fermentation and frying garlic. He felt like a classical musician who had wandered into a heavy metal concert. The producers had set up a East meets West pasta challenge, pitting Marco's traditional techniques against a local champion. Marco assumed he would be facing a chef trained in French or Italian techniques, someone who played by the rules. He was wrong. His opponent was a 70-year-old grandmother named Lola Benita, a woman who had never stepped foot in a culinary school but had fed her entire neighborhood for 4 decades from a small carinderia eatery attached to her living room. Benita was small, with skin weathered by the sun and eyes that crinkled permanently into a smile. She wore a simple apron over a floral dress, contrasting sharply with Marco's crisp, pristine white chef's coat and tall toque. When they were introduced, Marco offered a stiff, formal nod, while Benita reached out and squeezed his hand with both of hers, calling him Oppo, grandchild. The audience cheered, but Marco felt a spike of irritation. He felt the contest was a farce, a joke set up to humiliate him by placing him on the same stage as a home cook. He didn't know that Benita was a local legend, the queen of comfort food. The challenge was announced, the soul of spaghetti. Marco immediately set to work, moving with the precise, robotic efficiency of a master. He had flown in his own ingredients, trusting nothing from the local markets. He began blanching tomatoes to peel them, the water at a precise rolling boil, salted to the exact salinity of the Mediterranean Sea. He was making spaghetti al pomodoro, the simplest and most difficult dish to execute perfectly. It was a statement of intent. He wanted to show the crowd that greatness lay in restraint. The camera crew zoomed in on his knife work, which was a blur of motion. He was confident, bordering on arrogant, occasionally glancing over at Lola Bonita's station with a look of pitiable confusion. He expected her to be struggling, but instead, she was humming a tune, opening distinct bottles and cans that made Marco freeze in his tracks. It started when Marco saw the sauce. It wasn't the deep, vibrant red of vine-ripened tomatoes. It was a shocking neon-bright crimson that looked almost artificial under the stadium lights. He watched in horror as Bonita squeezed bag after bag of banana ketchup into a massive wok. To Marco, banana ketchup was a mythical antagonist he had only heard rumors of, a wartime substitute made from mashed bananas, sugar, vinegar, and spices dyed red to mimic the real thing. Seeing it used as a base for a pasta sauce made his stomach churn. Then came the processed cheddar cheese, grated in mountains, followed by condensed milk. Condensed milk and spaghetti? Marco audibly scoffed, a sound picked up by his lapel microphone, causing a ripple of laughter in the audience. He shook his head, muttering in Italian about the death of cuisine, convinced he was witnessing a culinary crime scene. The final straw for the Italian purist was the meat. He expected perhaps a ground veal or a high-quality pork sausage. Instead, he watched Bonita slicing bright red hot dogs on a bias. These were not artisanal sausages. They were the kind of processed meat Marco wouldn't even feed to a stray dog in Rome. She tossed them into the wok along with ground beef and garlic. The smell of sweet, caramelizing sugar filling the air. It didn't smell like dinner to him. It smelled like a dessert gone wrong. He turned to the camera, breaking the fourth wall, and said, "This is not cooking. This is chemistry. It is an insult to the history of the noodle. The producers loved it. This was the conflict they wanted. The god of pasta versus the jolly spaghetti." Marco was playing his role perfectly, unaware that he was setting himself up for the biggest fall of his career. As the clock ticked down, the contrast between the two dishes became stark visual poetry. On the left, Marco's plate was a study in minimalism, a nest of perfectly al dente pasta lightly coated in a translucent, oil-rich tomato sauce, garnished with a single perfect basil leaf. It was elegant, sophisticated, and cold. On the right, Lola Bonita's creation was a chaotic mountain of noodles drowning in thick, opaque red sauce, studded with hot dog coins and topped with generous, unrefined heap of grated yellow cheese that was already beginning to melt into a gooey mess. It looked messy, childish, and exuberant. When the buzzer sounded, Marco wiped his brow, looking satisfied. He believed that once the judges and the audience tasted the difference between real food and fast food, the matter would be settled. He didn't understand that taste is memory, and he was fighting against a nation's childhood. The judging panel consisted of two local food celebrities and Marco himself, who was required to taste his opponent's dish. This was the moment the script called for. The local judges tasted Marco's dish first. They nodded politely, praising the acidity of the tomatoes and the texture of the pasta, but their eyes didn't light up. They respected the technique. But the dish felt foreign, detached from the humid, festive atmosphere of the night. It was technically perfect, but emotionally hollow. Marco accepted their praise with a smug nod, interpreting their polite restraint as awe. Then it was time for Filipino spaghetti. The judges dug in with gusto, smiling as the sweet sauce hit their palates. They spoke of birthdays, of family gatherings, of comfort. Then the host turned to Marco. A hush fell over the crowd. The Italian chef stared at the plate in front of him as if it were radioactive. Marco picked up his fork, holding it like a weapon. He poked at a slice of red hot dog, lifting it to eye level with a sneer. "In Italy," he began, his voice amplified across the silent market, "we treat ingredients with respect. We do not mask them with sugar. We do not use this." He gestured vaguely at the hot dog. "This dish represents everything wrong with modern consumption. It is excess without discipline." The crowd murmured, some offended, some amused by his seriousness. Lola Bonita just smiled, her hands clasped in front of her. "Chef," she said softly, speaking into her microphone, "please, just taste. Don't think about Italy. Think about being a child." Marco rolled his eyes, sighing theatrically. He twirled a small, reluctant amount of pasta onto his fork, ensuring he got the minimum amount of sauce possible, and placed it in his mouth, fully prepared to spit it out. The flavor profile hit him with the subtlety of a freight train. It was aggressively sweet, a sweetness that terrified his savory trained palate. The banana ketchup brought a tang that was entirely unlike the acidity of tomatoes. It was sharper, spiced, and fruity. The condensed milk added a creamy richness that coated his tongue, and the processed cheese provided a salty counterpoint that, against all his logic, worked. His brain screamed wrong, but his mouth was confused. The texture was softer than the al dente he worshipped. The noodles were cooked through, yielding and comforting. It was a flavor that defied every rule in his library, a chaotic clash of sugar, salt, and umami. He chewed slowly, his face a mass of intense concentration. He was trying to formulate a critique, try and find the words to describe why this was objectively bad. But a strange sensation was rising in his chest. As he chewed, the initial shock of the sugar faded, leaving behind a lingering savoriness from the garlic and the ground meat. He looked up and saw Lola Benita watching him, not with the anxiety of a competitor, but with the warmth of a grandmother feeding a stubborn child. Suddenly, the noise of the crowd seemed to fade. Marco was transported back to a memory he hadn't accessed in 30 years. He was 6 years old, sitting in his Nana's kitchen in Naples, but he wasn't eating her famous ragu. He was eating a bowl of buttered noodles with cheese, a simple, incorrect dish she made him when he was sick or sad. It wasn't real Italian cooking, but it was a food that made him feel safe. The sweetness of Benita's spaghetti triggered that same dormant receptor in his brain. The connection between food and safety, between flavor and love. Marco swallowed. The critique he had prepared died in his throat. He looked at the red hot dog he had mocked. In the context of high cuisine, it was garbage. In the context of this dish, it was a textural joy, a snap of processed nostalgia that added a playful element to the soft noodles. He realized with a jolt that he had been judging the dish by the wrong metric. He was judging it as spaghetti bolognese, which it wasn't. It was Filipino spaghetti, a distinct cultural entity with its own history, evolved from American occupation, wartime scarcity, and Filipino ingenuity. It wasn't a failed attempt at Italian food. It was a successful execution of Filipino food. His arrogance began to crack. The wall of tradition he had built around himself had a gate, and Lola Benita had just walked right through it with a bag of banana ketchup. The silence stretched on for too long. The host prompted him, "Chef Marco, your thoughts?" Marco looked down at the plate. He had eaten one bite. The polite thing to do was to offer a diplomatic compliment and move on. But Marco was a man of extremes. He didn't do diplomacy. He slowly lowered his fork and looked at the audience. Then at Benita, "It is..." He started, his voice rough. "It is completely wrong." The crowd gasped. Benita's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Marco continued, "It is too sweet. The pasta is overcooked by my standards. The cheese is industrial." He paused, letting the harsh words hang in the humid air. The producers in control booth were high-fiving. They had their villain. But Marco wasn't finished. He picked up his fork again. "However," Marco said, raising his voice, "I am judging this as an Italian, and that is my mistake." He looked at the fork. "If I judge this as a dish designed to bring joy, if I judge this as a dish meant to hug you from the inside." He stopped, struggling with his own ego. He took a second bite, a much larger one this time, scooping up a slice of hot dog and a heavy amount of sauce. The crowd went wild, cheering and clapping. He chewed, and this time he didn't analyze. He just ate. He let the unpretentious, joyful flavor wash over him. It tasted like a birthday party. It tasted like a celebration. It lacked the sophistication of Rome, but it possessed the heart of Manila. He swallowed and pointed at Benita with his fork. "You have broken every rule I hold dear, madam, and I am angry at how much I am enjoying this." The tension in the arena broke into laughter and applause. Lola Benita laughed, a rich, hearty sound. "It is a secret ingredient, chef," she said into the mic, "love, and a little bit of sugar." Marco shook his head, a wry smile finally breaking through his stoic mask. He pushed his own plate of perfect, 3-ingredient pomodoro to the side. It suddenly looked lonely, austere, and uninviting compared to the festive mess on Benita's plate. He realized that in his pursuit of perfection, he had forgotten the primary purpose of cooking: to feed people not just their stomachs, but their spirits. His food was to be admired. Her food was to be devoured. It was a humbling lesson delivered by a woman who probably didn't know what a Michelin star was, and didn't care. The filming wrapped up with Marco declaring Benita the winner, a move that wasn't even in the script. The producers were stunned but delighted. The redemption arc is always better than the villain arc. But the story didn't end when the cameras stopped rolling. Usually, after a shoot, the talent retreats to their trailers or hotels. Marco, however, lingered at the station. The crew was breaking down the lights, and the crowd was dispersing. Marco walked over to Lola Benita, who was packing away her leftover ingredients into Tupperware containers. He watched her for a moment, stripped of his persona, stripped of the expectations of the culinary world. He looked like a student again. He approached her with a hesitation that was entirely uncharacteristic of the Lion of Naples. "Signora?" Marco said, using the Italian term of respect. Benita looked up, surprised. "Chef Marco, you want to scold me about the hot dogs again?" she teased. Marco chuckled, looking down at his shoes. "No, I wanted to ask, the sauce, the base. You saute the garlic first, or the onions?" Benita's eyes widened. The great Italian chef was asking for the recipe. She waved him over. Come, I show you." For the next hour, while production crew waited impatiently for Marco to leave so they could lock up, the two of them stood over the cooling wok. She explained the balance of the banana ketchup, how the vinegar in it needed to be cooked off before adding condensed milk. She explained why the hot dogs had to be fried separately to keep their texture. Marco listened intently, taking notes on a napkin. He asked questions about the brand of ketchup, the fat content of the ground meat. He was treating the recipe with the same seriousness he would apply to a complex risotto. He realized that what he had dismissed as throwing things in a pot was actually a calibrated balance of flavors that had been refined over generations. It was a different language of food, one spoken in high volume and bright colors. He told her about his grandmother in Naples, and she told him about feeding her grandchildren in Quiapo. They spoke different dialects of the same universal language, the desire to care for others through sustenance. The cultural barrier that had seemed insurmountable at the start of the day had been dissolved by a shared meal. Then came the moment that became legend among the production crew. The wok was empty, scraped clean by the staff who had devoured the leftovers. Marco looked at the empty pan with genuine regret. He had been so busy analyzing the second bite and dissecting the recipe that he hadn't actually finished a full portion. He looked at Lola Benita. Is there any more?" he asked, his voice low. Benita laughed and shook her head. "All gone, chef. The crew, they're like vultures." Marco looked visibly disappointed. "But," she added, "my house is not far. I have more ingredients there. You come? I cook for you. Real dinner. No cameras." It was an offer that broke every protocol of the show's security and schedule. Marco didn't hesitate. "I would be honored," he said. That night, Marco Moretti, the man who had cooked for prime ministers and movie stars, sat on a plastic monoblock chair in a small, cramped dining room in the back streets of Manila. The room was decorated with family photos and a small altar. A fan whirred rhythmically in the corner, fighting the tropical heat. Benita's family, children, grandchildren, neighbors, crowded around, staring wide-eyed at the foreigner in their midst. Benita cooked a fresh batch of spaghetti, the smell filling the small house. This time, there was no pressure, no lights, no audience, just the clatter of spoons and the sound of laughter. When she placed a steaming plate in front of him, piled high with red sauce and yellow cheese, Marco didn't critique it. He ate. He ate with his hands, using a spoon and fork in the Filipino style. Clumsy at first, but learning quickly from the children watching him. He devoured the first plate in minutes, wiping the sauce from his lips with a paper napkin. The sweetness no longer shocked him. It felt like a warm embrace. The hot dogs were savory bursts of salt. The cheese was creamy and rich. It was unpretentious, honest and delicious. When he finished, he looked at Benita, who was waiting anxiously for his verdict in this private setting. He didn't say a word. He simply held out his plate, a silent, universal gesture. "Second plate, please," he said, smiling. The room erupted in cheers. The Italian chef had been converted, not to the technique, but to the spirit. Marco returned to Italy a changed man. The change wasn't immediate or loud, but it was deep. He didn't start serving hot dogs in his Michelin-starred restaurant. He respected the boundaries of his own tradition too much for that. But something in his kitchen shifted. The atmosphere at La Purezza became less militaristic. He allowed his chefs to experiment more. He stopped writing scathing editorials about fusion cuisine. He realized that by guarding the gates of tradition so tightly, he had been keeping joy out. He understood now that authentic didn't mean ancient. Authentic meant true to the people eating it. Filipino spaghetti was authentic to the Philippines, just as carbonara was authentic to Rome. Both were valid. Both were true. 6 months later, a package arrived at Lola Benita's Carinderia. It was a heavy box from Rome. Inside were cans of San Marzano tomatoes, a block of Parmigiano Reggiano aged 24 months, and a bottle of extra virgin olive oil. There was also a note, handwritten on heavy, expensive stationery. It read, "To the Queen of Spaghetti, these are the ingredients of my home. They are not better than yours, just different. Please use them however you like. Perhaps they will taste good with banana ketchup. Your friend, Marco." Benita laughed, showing the letter to her customers. That night, she made a special, a Moretti-style Filipino spaghetti, using the San Marzano tomatoes as a base, but still adding her signature sugar and hot dogs. It was a hit. The episode of Global Palate aired and became a viral sensation. The clip of Marco's initial disgust followed by his humble request for seconds was shared millions of times. It became a symbol of cultural bridge building. People loved watching the arrogant master be humbled by the sweet, simple reality of home cooking. Marco's restaurant saw an influx of Filipino tourists, all hoping to see if he had put the dish on the menu. He hadn't. But whenever Filipino guests identified themselves, Marco would personally come out of the kitchen to greet them, often joking, "I am sorry, I have no banana ketchup today." It was a private joke, a nod to the lesson he had learned. But the story has a quieter, more profound ending. A year after the competition, Marco was interviewed by a prestigious culinary magazine. The interviewer asked him about the Filipino incident, expecting to laugh it off as a moment of television madness. Marco turned serious. "That plate of pasta," he told the reporter, "taught me more about cooking than 3 years of culinary school." The reporter looked skeptical. "It was hot dogs and ketchup, chef," she said. Marco nodded. "Exactly. It was food stripped of ego. In Europe, we cook to impress. We cook to show how clever we are. That woman cooked to make people happy. I had forgotten that was a job. I was a technician. She was a feeder. I would rather be a feeder." Back in Manila, Lola Benita's business boomed. The Global Palate fame brought lines that stretched around the block. But she didn't expand into a franchise or change her recipe. She stayed in her kitchen, stirring the same giant wok. She kept a photo of her and Marco, taken that night in her living room, framed on the wall. In the photo, Marco is holding a plate of spaghetti, his mouth covered in red sauce, giving a thumbs up. It is the only photo of him in existence where he looks completely unposed, completely unguarded. It serves as a reminder that food is the great equalizer. No matter how many stars you have on your door, a good meal is simply one that tastes like love. The legacy of that encounter rippled out in unexpected ways. Young Filipino chefs, who had previously felt pressured to abandon their sweet spaghetti for proper Italian techniques to be taken seriously, began to embrace their heritage. They started elevating Filipino spaghetti, not by removing the sugar, but by celebrating it. It sparked a conversation about the validity of post-colonial cuisine. Marco Moretti had unwittingly become the godfather of a movement he had initially tried to destroy. By validating the dish with a second plate, he gave permission for a generation to be proud of their palate. It was a strange twist of fate. The guardian of Italian purity helped validate Filipino fusion. Marco eventually retired from the daily grind of the kitchen, passing La Purezza to his sous chef. In his retirement, he wrote a memoir titled The Second Plate. The cover did not feature a pristine dish of pasta or a landscape of Tuscany. It featured a simple, graphic illustration of a red hot dog. In the final chapter, he described the night market in Quiapo. He described the heat, the noise, and the taste of that first bite. He wrote, "I went looking for bad food and found a good heart. I went to teach a lesson and ended up becoming the student. The world is full of flavors that don't make sense on paper, but make perfect sense on the tongue. Never be too proud to ask for seconds." And so, the story of the Italian pizza chef who mocked Filipino spaghetti remains a favorite anecdote in the culinary world. It is a parable of pride and prejudice, of tomatoes and bananas. It reminds us that while recipes have rules, food has a soul. The rules can be written in books, but the soul is found in the sticky, sweet, neon red sauce served by a grandmother who just wants you to eat. Marco Moretti may have arrived in Manila as a critic, but he left as a human being, with a full stomach and a wider heart, forever changed by the simple, undeniable power of a hot dog-studded plate of pasta.